everybody. My name's Caroline Baum. I'm the ambassador for the Older Women's Network, and it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here with you this morning in this beautiful place with this very distinguished panel of people to talk about this very important subject. We've got more than 200 people registered online, so you may feel like you're part of a small audience, but in fact you are not. You are part of a much bigger audience. And of course, many, many people will be watching this after today. People who are streaming are welcome to send in questions as part of the forum. And you, of course, are going to be given a lot of time this morning to ask questions too. And I don't want this to be formal. I don't think this feels like it should be a formal occasion. So, you know, if you're really desperate to ask a question whilst we're in conversation, put your hand up and we'll try and come to you, because I think, you know, if you're desperate to ask a question, then we need to hear it. To kick things off, I would like to introduce Auntie Deborah Lennis, who is going to give us the welcome to country. Deborah is a proud Darawal woman, a local elder, and the cultural advisor to the CEO for the Inner West Council. She's worked across all aspects of the field of education for over 20 years, from preschool to adults. And she also has degrees in child sciences and tourism and a Bachelor of Education in Aboriginal Studies and History. Please welcome Auntie Deborah.
Thanks, Caroline. As she said, yes, I am a proud Darawal woman, a local elder, and my name is Deborah Lennis. And I'm also just the cultural advisor now at Inner West Council. I have changed job titles since they got that CV. And I've got the honour of welcoming you here all this morning on behalf of the Inner West Domestic Violence Committee and the elders of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation are the lands that are bordered by the three rivers of the Hawkesbury to the north, Nepean to the west and Georges to the south, and of course our gorgeous coastline along the east. And within that, 29 different languages are spoken. Birawagal Naninya Birawagal, Wan Yaranai Gara, Dai Nariyarang Guragal, Yangunan Nangun Birawagal Burongni, Di Nai Nara, Ni Naranaba, Nangun Warren, Nawe Nangubai, Nangana Yarawa, Garawa, Banawa, Warawa. Birawagal Naninya Birawagal. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. The Wangal peoples lived at this place. This morning, I welcome all of you. Look at this country, the country of the Aboriginal ancestors, past, present and merging. This land is and always will be Aboriginal lands, as we never ceded sovereignty over these lands. The Aboriginal culture is the oldest living culture in the world, a culture that was denied when this country became part of the British nation. Today, we're here to have a panel discussion and talk about the needs to address coercive control. We'll be looking at what actions and justice can be practically achieved for the perpetrators of coercive control. Now, it's interesting to hold this event here at the New Marrickville Library, which is at a place that we've now called Paddy Garang. It's part of the Mizaburi ward here of Inner West Council. And the reason I say it's interesting to hold this event here, it's because of the story of Paddy Garang. She was a young Aboriginal woman, 14 years old, and was befriended by Dawes from the First Fleeters, somewhat 36 years old. She taught him some local language, however, became ostracised by the community. So when Matt asked me to actually come and do this welcome, it's actually been one of the longest ones I've thought about writing, and what does this actually mean? How long has it been happening here? And it was these stories that came to mind. So what I do is I do encourage you to discover more about Paddy Garang herself, but also others, including Benelong, and others that we actually hold quite close to the colonisational heart. However, the stories behind that. So I would especially like to welcome Christine and Hayley, Lyndal, Talie and Rukhshana, and any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples we have present today. and acknowledge their ancestors for bringing them here all safely. I'd especially like to thank the Inner West Domestic Violence Liaison Committee and Matthew Blaine, which that committee is made up of organisations including Inner West Council, both government and non-government, and we're interested into making sure domestic violence prevention is here for everybody. So I'd like to thank them for inviting me here to say, and from every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person in Australia, Birrawagal, Naninya, Birrawagal, welcome everyone, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Deb, for that beautiful welcome. It would be nice to think that one day we could all follow that without needing a translation. Now, before we get underway, just a couple of little housekeeping things that you might need to know. Obviously, if there's an emergency, we all run through that door. If you're looking for the bathrooms, they're over to my left, so through that door there. And then finally, there is another one of these QR codes. I know we're all sick of them. But this one is not a registration one. This is actually, we need you to scan this, if you wouldn't mind, to take part in a survey that we're doing, which is important to sort of back up everything that we're talking about today. So please scan this. Please do the Survey Monkey survey. Okay, I think that's that. I said before that I was here as the ambassador for the Older Women's Network, but actually this is much more personal for me. I am also the daughter of a survivor of domestic violence. My grandfather shot and murdered my grandmother. So I have seen the devastation that this causes firsthand, and I feel very passionate about this subject. It does seem to me, however, that we are in a unique moment, and all sorts of things are being talked about with a new kind of openness. Consent is the one where we're making real progress in terms of legislation and also in discussions that are being held with the police and in schools. So there is reason to think that with the right leadership, and we have a great display of that leadership here today, we can change things. I hope all of you have watched the three-part series of Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do, on SBS. It's pretty uncomfortable viewing, but I learnt a lot from watching that. And there is also an insight program on SBS, I think it's called Intimate Terrorism, which again is pretty distressing viewing, but it's fantastic for sort of context for the conversation that we're having today. Coercive control. It's worth just sort of revisiting what this actually means. It can mean so many different things, which is part of the problem. Intimidation, surveillance, and the one that I find that people still, particularly men of a certain vintage, don't necessarily know the meaning of the term, even if they're practicing it, is gaslighting. And gaslighting is a really interesting one because it comes from a 1944 black and white movie starring Ingrid Bergman, in which Ingrid Bergman is married to a man who is trying to persuade her that she's going mad. And the way that he does it is by turning down the gas lamps in their home. And she keeps saying, what's wrong with the light? And he keeps saying, everything's fine, everything's normal, you must be going mad. So that's where the term comes from. Anyway, gaslighting, we all know what it means, but that's the origin. Humiliation, isolation, stripping away of autonomy, which can be, of course, financial independence, the use of spyware, which gets terrific attention in the first episode of See What You Made Me Do on SBS, threats of harm to family, deleting phone contacts. There are so many different ways to coercively control, and that is part of the challenge that we face. But there are positive strategies being developed to tackle these behaviours, and some of those I'm sure we're going to hear about today as we tackle the issue of legislation. We are, as I said, allowing plenty of time for questions from you. There will be a microphone that will come to you. Because we're live streaming this, we need for you to wait until the microphone comes to you for all sorts of technical reasons I won't go into. And I will just say, again, on a personal note, that I am very disappointed that we do not have a representative here from the police. It is not for want of trying. I just hope that when we have this forum again, that they will be here, because it is absolutely essential that we have someone from the police as part of this conversation. However, we do have some fantastic speakers this morning. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which I got their bios, which is not the order in which they're sitting. So please forgive me. But I'm just going to have to describe, or maybe you'll wave as I say your name. Christine. Christine Robinson is a Bundjalung woman from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, and she's the coordinator of Wirringa Baiya Aboriginal Legal Centre, which provides legal advice, casework and community education. And Christine is currently a member of the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault Council. Next to her, Hayley Foster. Is a domestic family violence advocate, former CEO of Women's Safety New South Wales, and she's had more than 20 years of experience in the community and justice sectors and family violence policy, practice and law reform. Laura Donnelly, who is very kindly stepping in at the last moment for Lyndal Gowland, who was unwell. Laura is a legal practitioner specialising in family and children's law at Holmes Donnelly & Co. She's also a family dispute resolution practitioner. Talie Starr is a singer and songwriter and survivor of domestic violence and a domestic violence advocate. She endured 6 years of abuse before leaving her husband. She's a member of the Homelessness New South Wales Policy Council, and she also runs singing workshops to empower people to discover their voice. And finally, at the other end, we have Rukhshana Sarwar, who is a caseworker for the Immigrant Women Speakout, helping women at risk of homelessness due to domestic violence. Rukhshana was born in Kabul, and she completed a degree in literature there. She arrived in Australia in 1997 and helped set up the Afghan Women's Network, and has been an interpreter for asylum seekers on Christmas Island. So will you please welcome them all? So I'm going to start with you, Christine. I've got some questions for each of the members of the panel, and then again with the panel, please jump in and comment and sort of interject when necessary, because I think that's going to make for a much richer conversation. Christine, can you start by giving us your perspective on coercive control and how that is experienced by Aboriginal women and how it manifests itself?
I think, is that on? Yep.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we experience is what you didn't touch on earlier, is around the cultural control, around cultural being able to, the isolation that comes with coercive control. Stopping Aboriginal women from being able to meet with their own family and their own mob, go to their own community. Land and country is really, it's spiritual and it's also really important to our people. So being able to not do that in a space of being able to, be able to practice your cultural protocols and your cultural practices is really important. So that's one of the ways that coercive control is sort of a little bit different in the Aboriginal area. I think as well as sort of, it's around religious, religious beliefs as well, because I think that's another thing that sort of wasn't mentioned earlier. And those are the things that sometimes are things that are just not recognised. For Aboriginal women, I think one of the things is that we know it's been around for a really long time. And I think everyone realises that coercive control is the practice that's been happening for decades and decades, and we've seen it, but we've not been able to call it what it is. It's never had a name. So we've seen a practice, and everyone knows what has seen it happening, and we've just sort of thought it be controlling or possessive behaviour, but it's actually coercive control. So now that it's got a name and it's got a label, we'll be able to, people will be able to talk about it a bit more and be able to identify it, because that's the problem. And I think we'll be talking about that a bit later on, around some of the things that we think are going to be the issues around it. It's around, being able to say what it is, but also being able to understand it, because our community is not, it's one thing to sort of say this is a new thing, but it's being able to say it in urban Sydney is one thing, but saying in rural, remote Aboriginal communities is another thing. And so people being able to understand what that means and actually understand that they're suffering, or they're actually but this is being perpetrated against them, is going to be a different thing. It's about that, talking about the language, it's talking about what it is, it's identifying it and knowing that it's been happening for years. We have women that still, as a statewide service, we go out and we meet with Aboriginal women across the state, and some don't understand or don't recognise that they are being sexually assaulted and they are being sexually abused in a relationship, because the level of information or education that they receive is very limited. Financial abuse, not understanding that, the elders' abuse, all those different things. These days, the community is getting a little bit more educated, a bit more sophisticated around a lot of these issues, but we're still not there. And so coercive control, if the non-Aboriginal community is struggling with it, what it is, you can imagine what it is like for the Aboriginal community. It's, 10 times worse, basically. But understanding that is going to be the thing. And I don't know if I've gone off track or if I've answered your question, but I think they're the main things for us, is about saying that there are differences and being able to go onto land and being able to take our families or our kids to our community, because as Aboriginal people, most of the time Aboriginal people will come from different communities, so different mob or different groups. And so even though you may live on one land with your partner and you want to go back to your own country, that could be a really challenging sort of issue to be able to do, but also for sorry business. We go back to our community, and being isolated, being able to go back and represent ourselves or represent our family at these really important cultural or significant events in our community is really important as well. So
I think one of the other things that we didn't really touch on, I didn't touch on the introduction, but you've kind of raised there, and I'd love you and Rukhshana to talk about this, is cultural shame. Is very specific to particular cultures, how people feel about reporting something to the police or even discussing it with someone who's not a member of their own family, and that presents other issues, doesn't it?
I think that's one, and I don't know, so I don't want to jump too far ahead with all your questions, but they will be the issues. It's about naming it, it's about who you're going to speak to about it, whether or not it's going to be someone in your own community, whether or not it's going to be a non-Aboriginal organisation or an Aboriginal organisation, whether or not they understand what it is. It's not just the Aboriginal communities that are affected by this. It's also some of the non-Aboriginal communities in some of those areas that just don't have the resources or capacity or the knowledge or understanding of what these issues are. And the other thing that we will experience as Aboriginal women is of course the discrimination and the racism that comes with it. People just thinking it's normalised behaviour, that it's stereotypical attitudes, and just thinking, them fellas are used to that kind of behaviour. Let them just work it out between themselves, because that's what happens sometimes, and unfortunately, that's the truth. And so that's what one of the things is that we're concerned about, is also that when if Aboriginal women do come forward and report it, are they going to be seen as the perpetrator? Are they going to be misidentified as being the predominant aggressor? And we're really concerned around that issue because of the high rates of Aboriginal women in prison. We're the fastest growing group in the prison population of Aboriginal women. Most of our women in prison, around 80% of them, have experienced violence, whether or not it's been sexual violence or physical violence or family or domestic violence. So we've got a high range of, statistically we're one of the fastest growing groups, so we're 1/3 of the population in prisons as women, but we're also only make up 3% of the population in New South Wales, so it's quite concerning, and they're some of the issues that we're concerned around. Is that police misidentifying who the perpetrator is, women actually being incarcerated, or that would be in the long term, but that would be something that would be a concern for us, is just the women being misidentified. And the other issue for us as Aboriginal women is that if we're in relationships with non-Aboriginal partners, the racism and the bias or the unconscious bias sometimes just happens, that sometimes it's an automatic discrimination, and people or the police or whatever services that are responding, the justice system actually seem to side with the non-Aboriginal person. And the other thing for Aboriginal women is that sometimes we're not seen as the upset, the traumatised woman, because sometimes when we are reporting it, it's been after maybe after 5 or 6 years or 10 years of abuse, and finally, when we snap, then we're seen as the aggressor when they do actually come to an incident, and then they see us as being the problem. And so if you look at women, Aboriginal women that are incarcerated, they're usually incarcerated for minor offences. And they usually have bail refused at a higher rate than non-Aboriginal women. So there's a lot of issues that we, even though it seems like a small issue in relation to the coercive control, but we look at the other issues are the complications and the consequences of what will happen if it is brought in and if it's not brought in properly. And we're not saying that we don't agree with coercive control being legislated, but what that looks like when it happens and how it happens is what we're concerned about.
Absolutely, and I think those unintended consequences that you mentioned are really very, very scary, and they do actually apply to many, many cultures and across the board. That idea that the perpetrator is not the person who gets prosecuted, that in fact it's the victim who is misidentified often by police for being in a heightened emotional state and presenting in a particular way where a perpetrator might actually look very calm. And so, the victim gets to be punished, which is a terrible, terrible irony. So thank you for that.
Can I just add too, and I just wanted to mention as well children, because when we do a report, that is one of the main primary concerns as a woman, as an Aboriginal woman, is that will our children be safe, will our children be removed if I report this violence? So this is always in the background. So even though we know that a lot of these behaviours have been going on for years, the fact that we can't tell if women are coming forward or not, because we sort of don't understand whether or not the reporting rate is higher, because it seems to be sort of dormant, really. But in saying that, are more women reporting because they feel safer to do so, or are less women reporting because they feel unsafe to do so? And that's because of the justice system, and it's because of the care system and, the stolen generations. These things seem, to some people, it seemed like it happened a really long time ago. But we are still directly affected by stolen generations. My mother was removed, I can say that much, that she was removed, and she was removed when she was 3 months old, and she wasn't released. She was in Bomaderry Infants Home, she went to Cootamundra Girls Home, and then she was released as a domestic servant, and then she was actually pretty much a free woman to do what she wanted to do after that, if you want to call it like that, because people don't call it slavery, but in actual fact it was. So to say that, I think, is really important, that it seems like a bit far removed because people think it was like, 200 years ago. Well, look, the effects are felt today, and I think that's the important thing to remember.
Yeah, so it's layer of trauma on layer of trauma. And of course, even if you are a victim, that doesn't mean that you necessarily want to see your partner, who is the father of your children, taken off to jail, because that doesn't solve things necessarily for you either.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the other important thing is that the Aboriginal community also have a view on what that looks like. And I think one of the important things around coercive control, if it is legislated, if it does become legislated, like I said, but some of the things around that, there needs to be wider and better consultation. And one of the things is that we've said, it was a very tight turnaround. We think it's really good that Mark Speakman, the Attorney General, has decided to really move so fast on a number of the issues that he's moving on. But in saying that, sometimes, you've got to put the horse before the cart, and you've got to make sure things are in place so that, when the domino falls, it falls in the right place. And I think that's one of the things that we're concerned about. It's good to sort of do those things, but actually have have some thought about what that looks like, but also consult with the people that's going to affect the most. Absolutely. And I think victims, are really part of that process. I think Aboriginal women and Aboriginal communities, as you mentioned, Aboriginal men, there's a position around that, what that looks like, and there's other community people as well that need to have a say as well. So I think that's just making sure that these things just don't be rushed.
No.
That we take time, we take consideration, and that we think about it, and we actually think about the long-term effects, rather than rush something in and then do it, and then look at, what we've done wrong and what we could have done better. Let's do it right and do it right in the first place if we do it.
Thank you for that. Hayley, if I can come to you. In preparation of the parliamentary inquiry into coercive control, You conducted research into what women using domestic family violence services wanted. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and about your findings?
Yeah, thanks so much, and to acknowledging country and paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Is this on? And extend that respect to all the Aboriginal people who are here today. And thanks, Auntie Debbie, for a beautiful welcome. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, everything that Christine said, pretty much. But I think look, at the end of the day, our research was when I was the Chief Executive Officer of Women's Safety in New South Wales. We consulted with frontline domestic violence specialists across New South Wales, including the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Services, as well as a range of women's shelters, women's health and counselling service workers and women's legal, and also 72 victim survivors. So there were 46 respondents to the frontline survey, and there were 72 respondents. As Christine mentioned, it was a very short time turnaround, and it was a very extensive survey, so we had a lot of rich data there. What the results of that showed us is that there was a resounding agreement across frontline workers. Every single frontline specialist said that we needed to do this, and it was 97%, so 70 out of 72 of the victim survivors that we surveyed said, we absolutely need this reform, but it has to be, as Christine said, it has to be done well, and it has to be done as a comprehensive reform. Law change is really, really important because it sends a strong signal as to what, as a community, we will accept and tolerate, and what is harmful behaviour, and in fact, what is domestic violence. And so it's very, very important for setting the tone. But law changes, as we know, from previous reforms that we've done in this space, they themselves aren't going to change it unless we actually change our systems and our culture, but essentially our practice across the board. And I would probably say, before I get into all the other findings, that the number one thing here is actually not training, is not changing the tools and guidelines. All those things are critically important. But the number one thing I would say is accountability. Because what we're seeing now, for example, when it comes to exactly what Christine was talking about, the misidentification, for example, of the primary aggressor, we have a situation in this country, it's the same in New South Wales, of around 1 in 5 domestic violence offenders are female. And we know from the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey, we know from working on the front line, that's not right. That it's more 95% or more of the domestic violence perpetrators are male, and so we have a really big problem in our system in the way in which we understand and the way in which we respond to domestic and family violence. One of the things that was picked up in this survey, answering the question now, one of the things picked up in this survey was that we asked about the need to move from an incident-based system to a system that identifies and picks up on patterns of behaviour over time. So that situation that Christine was talking about where, someone could be subjected to severe coercive control for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and then finally snap. And in fact, if they don't trust the system because they're afraid they're going to be misidentified, they're afraid of what's going to happen to their family, they're afraid of what's going to happen in terms of their children being taken away. So it gets to the point where women are genuinely defending their very existence and life, and they can respond violently, and that is a massive issue. So one of the things picked up in the survey was that both from frontline specialists, but also from victim survivors, is that this is going to be really important for reducing that, because finally police and courts will have to take into account that pattern of behaviour over time. Finally, the years and years and years of evidence of coercive control will become directly admissible. So those are some of the sorts of things. The number one thing, though, that came out strongly when we asked them what do you think the key benefits are, the number one thing was finally the laws will actually reflect my lived experience and I will feel validated, and that is incredibly powerful for my healing. And it's the same sort of idea of when we criminalised rape in marriage. We don't have a huge number of prosecutions of that, but the power of saying, that's illegal and you do not have the right to do that to me, is extremely powerful. And of course there are many other things, I won't take up time. There was a huge number of reasons why. it was regarded as being essential. But what I would absolutely say is that we have to do the best that we can to get this done right. We have to make sure that it's accompanied by exactly the training, the professional development, the updating of tools and guidelines and bench books and those sorts of things. But we absolutely need to make sure that the system is held accountable for their response. And lastly, and I feel like I'm repeating a lot of what Christine's saying, but community education. And it has to be done. We actually have to invest in local communities to do this work. We have to think about where are people understanding and learning about norms, cultural norms and expectations. They're doing it in their homes, in their families, in their communities, in their schools, in their workplaces, and their particular cultural groups. And it has to be the leaders within those groups that have that understanding and are resourced properly to do that work. Absolutely critical.
Can I just ask you further to that, Hayley? When you were talking about patterns of behaviour, that is going to require stepping up by police, social workers, all of the sort of the safety net of infrastructure before we're talking about prosecution. So what does that look like? I mean, what has to happen so that the police are trained to understand those long-term patterns of behaviour? I mean, there was one woman in the SBS program, I'm sure you saw, she'd been married for 40 years to her abuser. 40 years. Extraordinary. How do you go back over that sort of stretch of time? And I mean, one of the things that people who are against legislating coercive control use as an excuse is that the evidence is very hard to gather. But that doesn't really stand up when you think that actually the evidence was hard to gather for child sexual abuse, but we did it, and stalking and various other crimes. So what's your response to that as an excuse?
I think there's a lot in what you just said there, but I'll answer the last bit first. I think that that is an excuse, and it is going to require additional work from police and additional investigation. I will say that not everybody in New South Wales Police are against the idea. Certainly we've had some of those leaders in the domestic violence unit who have come out and said that they think we should just rely upon the civil scheme. But there are many police officers and senior police officers who want to see this change. And the reason being is that they want to be able to provide protection and safety, lasting safety to victim survivors. And so what they're sort of saying is that you do it and you do it right. So you actually, instead of having the repeat going back after incident and saying, no offence detected each time they go back, and we have women like in our services of like huge files of no offence. It's like, dude, this is what's happening. And so I think, and I guess the other misconception about there not being enough evidence, there's reams of evidence. So if you look at what's happening overseas, there's just so much. You know how all-encompassing coercive control is. Just think about the amount of evidence on mobile phones, on emails, on bank records, just interviewing people in their family and friends around the huge disconnect. Those things are really, really powerful. And in fact, what they're finding is that in Scotland, when the most recent stats came in, it was similar to earlier on, the prosecutors are saying this is fantastic because the evidence is so overwhelming. It just creates that pattern. And, the risk of misidentification is quite low because it's really hard to fake that to a criminal standard. And in fact, the evidence is so overwhelming that the vast majority, close to 80% of the cases are actually, the offenders pleading guilty. So, I think that that's important. That's not to say that there isn't a risk. And ultimately what I would say is it's the same with any other domestic violence response. We must hold those who are responsible accountable. And I'm really, really pleased that the Audit Office, the Auditor General, is going to be doing a review of policing, and it's very good timing. And in fact, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission is also undertaking a review of policing of domestic violence at the same time. Please take the opportunity to speak to the Auditor General. There's an email on the website ready to go, and you cannot be identified under statutory protection, so you can freely and fearlessly let the Auditor General know what you need to tell them about domestic violence responses from police.
Fantastic. Sorry, can we just get a microphone to you if you're going to ask a question? There's one at the back. Matthew's coming with one. Thank you. Everybody else feeling okay? Everybody all right?
I just had a question around evidence for coercive control. When my client had 6 phones smashed, there was no evidence. So it was all verbal, and that didn't go very far. So I just think that you say there's a lot of evidence by email, by messages, but that can all be removed very easily. And also the phones get smashed numerous times. And my other thing would be with the court system that if you go for this charge and then 3 months later there's another charge, the first charge doesn't come up. So how's that going to change? That's a question I have.
You're talking about the previous charge, like if there's a previous charge and then that the magistrate or the judicial officer doesn't have the information about the previous charge. Well, they if the police prosecutor is doing their job, they need to be able to provide that pattern of behaviour over time. But what I would say is, no, they're able to. I'm just saying they're able to. But what you're saying about whether they do or not, would completely agree with you. And it's touch and go. And at the moment, you have to rely upon, it is which responding officer is going to come out to the event, which police prosecutor you're going to get, and then which judicial officer. If you got the microphone still, because you're nodding, you're shaking your head.
Hang on. We need the microphone back to you. Sorry, I know it's laborious.
No. It wasn't the police. The police did the right thing, but when it gets to court, they said they are not allowed to look at previous charges.
Yeah, no, they absolutely are allowed to look at previous conduct, and so they can actually bring that up as relationship evidence and as background, but they often don't. Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. But with a coercive control offence, that will now become, like if we get this law, that will now become directly relevant and admissible evidence. So that is a benefit. That's where we will see the pattern of behaviour picked up, finally.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and thank you for your response, Hayley. Laura. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Just on that, on the topic of coercive control becoming legalised, how will that, and maybe I'm going way down the track, but how does that then translate when largely women are then taken through family law court around children? And will that then subsequently be effectively embedded in the family law court processes? Because it's one thing to prosecute around control and abuse, but it's the longer term impacts that we all know keep going. So I'm just curious about what the what's that looking like.
Segues into
I was going to say
almost perfectly into the next question.
to speak, and actually I think that
Perfect.
question is perfect for her.
Well, there you go.
Bang on where we were going to go with that. So, look, at the moment, as many of you might be aware, in 2012 they expanded the definition of family violence in the Family Law Act to include behaviours that were controlling and coercive. And there's a list of examples that is said to be non-exhaustive, some of which go to the issue of coercive control, financial control, isolation from family members, etc. But I have to say, in my experience, the acknowledgement of that, and it goes to the issue of evidence really in a family law context as well, satisfying a court that you tick the box, for want of a better word, as to family violence from a coercive control perspective or coercive behaviours. I don't think that's really recognised sufficiently at the moment. It is an issue of the difficulties in providing evidence, which we've talked a little bit about, and I think it's absolutely the issue of patterns of behaviour that is very difficult to get before the court. Where that goes to then in terms of the next step at the moment is that unless you tick the box of family violence, there's then a presumption of equal shared parental responsibility in terms of care, the decision making around care arrangements for children. So there has to be, if you then want to rebut that presumption, an acknowledgement, a greater acknowledgement of the coercive control behaviours. Otherwise, you're then going down this path of equal shared parental responsibility. So getting then to your question of how will a legalisation of coercive control have a flow-on effect in the family law system, I would be cautiously optimistic that if and when it reaches a criminal standard, that you are then, it is easier to satisfy the family court that this is the pattern of behaviour, this is family violence, as evidenced by this criminal charge, thereby this is a relationship of family violence. There should not be a presumption of equal shared parental responsibility, and we therefore should not be considering whether these children should be in an equal shared care arrangement or something along those lines. So, as I say, at the moment, coercive control really is not acknowledged sufficiently in the courts, in my view, in the family law system. But we talked earlier about being in a unique moment. There is absolutely the momentum of what is everybody's discussing in terms of coercive control currently, and there's education of the judiciary that Hayley and I were speaking about earlier as well, and I would again be cautiously optimistic that educating legal practitioners, the judiciary, everyone throughout that system, mediators and the like, about coercive control and the legalisation of it absolutely must have an impact on then the decision makers about what's going on for children if they are children of the relationships where this pattern of behaviour has been going on for such a long period of time or even a short period of time.
Can I just
Yeah,
one
Hayley.
thing to that, just really quickly. I think we cannot understate the importance of what Laura's saying around that training of judicial officers. That training is going to be the Safe and Together training, and there's going to be specific training on perpetrator patterns, on coercive control, and on protective parenting, and what that looks like and the different presentations of that. From there, we're looking at working with the Law Society about having that rolled out right across practitioners, and then through Relationships Australia and a range of other family relationship services, through all the family dispute resolution practitioners. And I have to say, I cannot overstate how big this is. We're really looking for a paradigm shift at this time. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. And just picking up on what you were saying there, Laura, with the case of Hannah Clark and her children, ex-partners, as we know, continue to exercise coercive control even after a woman has left the relationship. So how do you think the legislation would prevent that type of behaviour?
I thought about this a lot when we talked about this coming up as a question. I mean, that sort of evil is something that I think the answer to that question really goes to a psychology and a psychiatry issue almost as well, and whether a law is going to stop a person like that doing what they're going to do. I'm a lawyer, not a psychologist, but I'm not sure that that's going to change that level of extreme behaviour. But following on from what Hayley was saying earlier, acknowledging societally and therefore reflected in law that this sort of behaviour, coercive control behaviour and the patterns of it is something that is no longer acceptable in this society and reaches a criminal standard. I would like to think that earlier on in that scenario, as I understand it, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, that she was seeking help far earlier on numerous occasions and was not given the acknowledgement that clearly there should have been given. Whereas if we have a criminalisation of these matters earlier on, a recognition societally, if she's women are talking to their families and friends about this behaviour just doesn't seem quite right, and we're all, able to acknowledge that that's family violence, and saying that earlier on, talking about it, recognising the significance of it, recognising the seriousness and the dangerousness of it, as acknowledged by an legalisation of it, I would like to think that that's got to have an impact.
Can I just add to that? I think the way the system is at the moment is you don't get that pattern of behaviour to build up the case about the person, and I think that's one of the big problems. So it's individualised, so we just go, okay, so he hit you. And that is sometimes the attitude. Or, so he followed you. Once you start putting all those things together, that's where the difference comes. And I think that's where the situation for Hannah, she could have had a whole lot of evidence, and for other people that are out there, it's being able to put all of those dots together that actually makes it much more stronger. And we're currently flailing with nothing for women. We're not being followed up properly, and it's got to be changed.
And how many times, just how many times have any of us on the front line who've actually done this work day in, day out, or anyone who's experienced it, how many times do police say, look, did he hit you? Did he throw the phone? Have you got a direct threat in writing? And no, I don't have any of those things, but I'm terrified. Look, just give us a call back if he turns up. Just let us know if he assaults you. And that's, so it's a constant, that's just a constant thing of not being able to rely upon a response because it's not recognised and it's not directly admissible evidence.
Well, and also going back, this again segues to you, Talie, is perfectly. We were talking about leaving. Oh, sorry. That was yes.
I want to just add this point that one of the client experiences going to the police, she was from the Indian background, and this coercive control was reported to the police because she was fed up with this. And when she went there and reported, the police said, okay, was he doing this the same at home when you were in India? She said, yes, so why didn't you complain at that time? And then you can't get along when you're here, so it's not something serious. Yeah. So if it is not recognized as a violent act, so it is very difficult to prove especially for the called women, that they are very new here. They are not familiar with the system about the law, and they cannot navigate the law in jurisdictions. And the police, and when they are going and reporting once and there is no serious response and act from the police and the law system, so they keep quiet. And it is a very silent pain through the relationship that it will never be projected and out for the help and assistance.
Rukhshana, one of the things that complicates that, my understanding, is the issue of visas. And I want specifically to come back to the issue of visas in a moment. So I'm very glad that you raised that. Just to follow on, though, Talie, when we were talking before about Hannah Clark, in her case, she had moved out, she had gone to live with her parents. But one of the problems, obviously, is that for many, many women, there is nowhere to go. We have a completely inadequate situation as far as women's refuges. My understanding is that there is only one daytime refuge in Sydney, Lou's Place in King's Cross. It has not had any government funding for 21 years. You, as someone who endured 6 years of abuse, and actually when you left, your situation became, in a sense, worse. Yep. So I'm just wondering whether you can share some of your own lived experience in response to what's been discussed here today.
Sure. I just want to say there are more refuges, but I'll just leave that there. I think the difficulty is we keep saying leave, leave, leave. And I think that is the fundamental problem right there. What we need to say to a person, so I'm going to say person, women or victims, because there are victims in minority groups and LGBTQIA plus groups, so we need to be aware that it's not just women, but a majority of victims are women. And I think the problem is we're not saying to them, what do you need? How do you need to be safe? They're making so many decisions in every single moment of every day. How am I going to keep myself safe? How am I going to keep my children safe? How am I going to keep my pets safe? Am I going to make this decision? How is his behaviour today so I can work out what I do? And I think this is one of the fundamental problems that we're doing. And when we do that, we put more pressure on women. When we do that, we're victim blaming again. Like, you're not doing enough, you haven't got out, why don't you get your act together? And we can't do that to women anymore. We've got to turn this around and we've got to start saying, he can't do that anymore. He can't behave like that anymore. He needs to leave. Why doesn't he just leave? Because that's where it needs to come out. And I think when we do that, we start to build the safety of all victims of domestic and family violence. And then what we need to do, or maybe in conjunction with that, we need to be saying, what are the systems that we have out here and how are you working? Are you working from a premise of coercive control? Because that's exactly what we have. In every single government system, we work under the premise of coercive control. We work under the premise of male superiority, females and other marginal groups are less than. And if you start at that premise, you have got a huge problem. When I left, I thought, wow, I've made the hardest decision of my life. This is going to change dramatically now for me. I started envisioning, a life of being able to rent and develop friendships again, because I lost most of them because of him, because the perpetrator is seen as this magnificent person, an upstanding citizen in society. Mine was a musician. You were perfect for each other. We had a religious part of it, so I had faith, and so we were divinely brought together. How do you go against that? The amount of pressure that put up for me. But I did it. I made the decision, and my decision was a very quiet moment. I didn't have a safety plan because that stressed me out too much, but I had it in the back of my head, all the different thoughts that were going on about what I could potentially do. And in a quiet moment, I said, enough. I'm done. I'm worth better than this. It wasn't a rage, it wasn't a fight, it was just a very quiet, deliberate moment. But then my landlord put my rent up $140. I couldn't afford to live in the place I was living in. I couldn't find anywhere because the market was saturated with places you couldn't afford. I have disabilities, so I had to try and get on the pension. Was crying in Centrelink, which apparently if you haven't been cried, you haven't been to Centrelink. So, and then I was going to housing, and housing were telling me, oh, you can afford $328 on a pension a week. And I'm like, so what should I live on? Because that's all, or if not more, of the pension it was back then. And then they're coercively controlling me and telling me, you need to do this, you need to do that, you have to live here, even though they were offering me unsafe places to live. And that's the other problem. We don't have housing. We don't have appropriate housing. We are running our housing down and we are selling it off. 14% of housing gets sold every year, so housing gets some sort of budget. How can that be? When we have a shortfall, there's 116,000 people who are homeless in Australia. And if we think about a large percentage of women and older women and victims of domestic and family violence. So it has to change. This system works under this coercive control that we're talking about changing. And it meant that I lived for 5 years, I think I lived in about 14 different living situations. I was constantly moving. I have disabilities. It was wrecking my body. I had a serious fall at work, was in and out of hospital, was dealing with workers' comp, which also is a coercive control system. Now I'm dealing with the NDIS, which is exactly the same, and they're trying to make it like workers' comp. So the system doesn't help women. And I think if women need to leave, yes, but let's support them. And if women want to stay, then let's support them and let's put the funding there. And if we can't keep saying, I believe in helping women and victims of domestic and family violence, but I'm going to give you this much of the budget. And you need $150 million immediately? Well, how about if I give you $60,000 over 2 years, and then I'll split up another figure and I'll split that over a number of other years. So it's a long-winded answer to it, but I think that it's just all part of how complex it is and how difficult the system is and how coercive control interplays with every part of our lives.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Rukhshana, can I come back to you on that issue of visas, because it does add another level of vulnerability. And if you're on, for example, a bridging visa, then you are not eligible for a lot of the support systems that you need at this point in a crisis. So you're not eligible for Medicare, you're not eligible for all sorts of income support. So can you talk about that particular aspect?
Working in more than 15 years in this sector, helping the women in domestic violence. So the majority of our clients were those that they are on a temporary spouse partner visa or on bridging visa or student visa. That this group is the very vulnerable women in terms of when they are involved in a domestic violence situation. One of the elements of the coercive control is threatening. And this threatening is a good means for those perpetrators that they are sponsoring the women from overseas to marry, and they are getting married here. So whenever that they are doing, they have to threaten them. If you're not doing this, I will withdraw my sponsorship. If you're not doing this, I will deport you, send you back to. And women, because of not to dishonor the family and shame in the community, so they are trying to get whatever they are asking and requesting and doing, want, they are going to do this. And also, there is very much limited services for those women that they are in this situation, from, for example, Medicare. Even I have clients that the husband, or even the women that they are on a partner visa eligible to have a Medicare, they have not registered or taken any Medicare for them. They cannot go to, and they do not know, especially if they are illiterate in their own language. And coming here, they do not know the language, and they do not go outside to navigate that where is the services available, how they can get assistance from those services. So they are quite in a isolation and away from all these information. And what information that they are giving from the TV or from the newspaper or any other media, it is in English. They cannot understand. So there is a language barrier. And also the translation resources is very limited as well. If it is on a very short, it's not in details to be very educated in what they wanted to get the assistance. So these are the problem for those women, especially the called women coming to Australia as a refugee or a spouse migrant or bridging visa, student's visa. And for those that they are on a working visa and a student visa, situation is very, very tough when they are in a domestic violence situation. So there is no any services for them. Even they could be on a street because no refuge, except some of the refuges will take one or two. No refuges will accept those with no income or with no permanent residency. So it's a very, very tough situation for those women that they are in a situation of the domestic violence under these circumstances.
So do you have any stories that you can share with us of someone from a culturally and linguistically diverse background who has managed to get away from a situation of coercive control despite the obstacles that you've just identified so starkly?
So it is not specifically about the coercive controlling, but there are some other elements of the domestic violence, which is very easy to prove. For example, physical violence. A doctor's report or a psychologist's reports regarding to the injury or to the damage that she received. Yes, we were assisting them to apply for the permanent residency under the domestic violence provision. And she was able to get the permanent residency after processing. And now she is living, but still, as you said, Talie said, there is a lot of more problem regarding to housing. She cannot afford to, and Centrelink, and especially that nowadays they have changed also the Centrelink, the special benefit for people that they are under the spouse visa, and it is more than 3 years to be eligible for this, I think. So there is a lot of challenges that they are going to face after leaving the violent situation.
So what is the most immediate need for the migrant women who are vulnerable in this situation to feel safe? What do you think is the main priority?
In terms of safety issue, if there is a housing, that it is the very essential thing, especially those women that they have children. Might be contribution for being safe and where that they are living. And also employment, and if because of the language barrier and other barriers, they are not, eligible at this stage, for example, to get employed, but benefit from Centrelink to be to women. And the other thing that till that they are not getting the permanent residency, when they having children and the children are living with mother, the mother cannot access the children's benefit from Centrelink. It goes to father. So this is another issue. So they are in a vulnerable situation.
I know Hayley wants to respond, and then Laura, I'll come to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rukhshana. So important, and I guess just a couple of points. The federal government has heard loud and clear from all of those, particularly organisations like Immigrant Women Speakout Association and others, that we have a massive problem. This particular group, aside from First Nations women and children, this particular group are at the highest risk. We made it loud and clear the number one thing that needs to happen is that we need access to essential services, i.e. number one, Centrelink, as Rukhshana has said, and all the other services. First thing to say is that the domestic violence provisions aren't available to everybody, depending upon your visa class. Second thing to say is that until women experiencing violence, including coercive control, can access essential services, in particular Centrelink, they are going to have an issue with accessing anything else. And obviously work rights come with that as well. So I guess my point, and because this is being recorded, my point, and this is what I will be saying to Women's Safety Ministers at 12 today, is that we need structural responses to this. The $10,000 per victim survivor that's been offered in this budget is a band-aid solution. It's not going to actually ensure somebody can realistically escape. We need to address the structural issues, and that is that people have sustainable income while they resolve their matters, and there must be a pathway. There must be a protection visa, but there must be a pathway for people who are experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence. And we won't solve that until we're brave enough to take those structural change steps.
Absolutely. Laura?
I was just going to add to that on the issue of migrants with children and the issues that they face. I've had a number of clients over the years who the threat from the perpetrator is, well, I'll send you back to wherever, and the children will remain with me. And that's a real concern as to sometimes why these women remain in these relationships and are dependent on them from a migration perspective. But from some level of comfort, the experience that I've had is that those women who have children who make an application to the court and obtain orders in respect of the children living with them from a family law perspective, it certainly assists them with their visa issues if they go down that track. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that's an easy thing for anybody to do, but it is one thing that the family law system, I think, does well and protects migrant women from the risk of God forbid, deportation on visa issues in circumstances where they have otherwise been dependent on their perpetrator partner.
Thank you. We've got a question from the audience.
We do have a question, and also we are having questions come in on the chat line, so we are responding to those. So thanks very much for everyone at home for those.
I just had one question, whether Aboriginal or ethnic or Australian, is how do we change the AVOs to protect the children? Because in all the cases that I've had, the children have not been on the AVO, even if they were there at the time of the event, even if they were in the room at the time of the event. And that to me is a really huge issue.
So, well, children should be included on the AVO. So, and it goes back to what Hayley said earlier. It's about making the police accountable and the justice systems, the courts accountable to doing what they're supposed to do in the first place, and having good advocates around if the victim or the person that's the pin-up's actually taking it out and they don't have that aren't able to advocate on their own, is that to have advocates to be able to do that. We do that for some of our clients because they don't feel confident enough, or the imbalance of power, speaking to the police or bringing those issues up is going to be across the board for a lot of people. But in saying that, they should be doing it in the first instance. And then if we hold people, the police, the justice system, more accountable around that, hopefully they'll start recognising the importance and do it as a matter of fact, rather than have to be pulled over the coals when they've done it wrong.
Everything again that Christine just said, 100%. It's not a legal issue; it's a practice issue, and it's about accountability. And I guess what I would say in that regard is, imagine we had a situation when we had a poor police response. There was an independent place that we could make that complaint, it would be taken seriously and they would be held to account for that. And then imagine that every year the police force had that published about their performance in response to domestic violence in a public fashion. Okay, so again, everyone go to the Auditor General's website, find that email address. I'll get it circulated, and let's all request that, because I think at the end of the day, it's what Christine's saying. This is all about accountability. Yeah. Thanks.
I also want to say AVOs should be enforceable. It shouldn't have to wait for someone to be in someone's presence. You should be able to call and say, police, come now. And I understand police are stretched, but I think that's a really important thing. They're not enforceable. It's, oh yeah, we'll get there if we can. Is he doing it? Has he hurt you? Has he entered the property? And that's too late. The other thing I want to say is about the children. I think I grew up in domestic and family violence, and that's not why I married a perpetrator. I married a perpetrator because church teaches about coercive control and celebrates controlling men as strong and powerful leaders. And so I think that I want to break that idea that just because you grew up in domestic and family violence does not mean you're going to marry into it. It is because of the coercive control of the perpetrator. And children suffer immensely in domestic and family violence. We don't recognise them as victims. We've completely failed to do it. What I went through as a child was absolutely horrendous and on a daily basis, and it cannot be allowed to happen. And we cannot keep saying to children, oh, you're just witnessing it, because just witnessing it is domestic and family violence. It is horrific. And then if you're witnessing it, most likely you're also experiencing it. And so I think we need to make sure we stop silencing the voice of children and young people, because their voice is going to lead how we change the future.
Absolutely, thank you. And particularly children who are pre-language,
Yes.
who can't speak for themselves. We've got a question over here, and then we're going to come to you. No, can we just, sorry, I just need to go where the microphone is.
I just want to talk about Band-Aid solutions and Band-Aid services. We often talk about the need for more services provided to victim survivors. The more concern is that, we often respond when the damage is already done, when there's a lot of victim survivors have already experienced long-term episodes of abuse, and then we are talking about the responses. The concern for me is that the perpetrators often continue those behaviours onto other relationships, not relationships, but personally connected who they're with, and continue. So therefore, the problem, the course continues, if not continues to grow. My curious about for you, Hayley, and anyone else is, what are we doing to reduce that? And if not, what should we do to reduce that?
Thanks so much for that question. Look, I think one of the things I didn't say, because it's a very long report, one of the feedback items from frontline specialists and victim survivors around the coercive control laws is that they think that this is going to help with earlier intervention, people recognising things earlier and getting a response earlier, and I think that's very important. There's a whole other conversation that we're probably not going to have today, but I'll touch on a couple of points about what you're talking about. This is not just about recognising it in the law. This is not just about getting access to justice. This is about protection and safety. There's a whole conversation about what happens once somebody's convicted. What do we do once someone's convicted? Does every magistrate and judicial officer, do they have the option to defer them or refer them into a behaviour change program that is culturally appropriate and, that is going to be effective for them? But there's a whole conversation about bail law and the bailing of people, and the fact that the laws, again, it's a practice issue, not a law issue, but that safety is not prioritised as the number one consideration. The risk assessments of frontline specialists, domestic violence specialists, is not taken into account in those decisions. In fact, victim survivors and frontline workers are often not advised that there's an application or asked for what conditions that should be placed on that, or even advised that he or she has been let out. So there is no communication around that. And then finally, and I know we're tight for time, finally, how are we supervising those offenders in the community? There are 60 electronic monitoring devices across the entire state. That's the budget allocation for domestic, family and sexual violence. 60 devices, including the handheld ones for victim survivors. So that might be 30 cases, and they're not all in use. So we are not investing in, we're not saying lock everybody up. There are certain cases where for protection we do need to contain the perpetrator and perhaps for a period of time and give her a reprieve to actually put in place some strategies. But what are we doing to monitor people in the community? And there is literally, in most cases, there's zero communication between corrective services and the services that are supporting victim survivors. And there's often literally no communication between men's behaviour change programs and the services that are supporting victim survivors either. So where's that accountability? So look, I know I'm going on, but there's a whole conversation that I'm extremely passionate about, because we have an obligation to make sure that people are safe in the community. It's the number one obligation of government, and it's falling down.
And when we're talking about perpetrators and coercive control, that's what they use for the whole system. So they can get into men's behaviour programs that last for a few weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, and they can look like they have completely changed. Like my perpetrator, you would not have seen him as a perpetrator. They are very, very good at managing the system. And I think this is another reason why coercive control needs to be criminalised, because we need to expose this behaviour. We need to be able to go, no, that actually is the behaviour you're using with your partner and you're now using it with me. Not okay, not acceptable. We need to have a long-term solution. Yes, we do need to do perpetrator rehabilitation, if that's possible, kind of programs. But we do also know a lot of perpetrators will not be rehabilitated. And to have that fallacy in our head, I think is dangerous, because then what we do is we keep in that, because you marry someone because you love them, or you're with them because you love them. And so that part is always playing into it. But he loves me and I loved him and he was this lovely person when I met him. And the difficulty is seeing that as part of the coercion as well. Like maybe he did love you, but he uses that also. They know how to tailor it for the person. So my perpetrator, I'll give you one example. He kicked a blanket box, really got angry, kicked the blanket box really heavily. Someone said to him, not realising actually that was physical violence in that moment, said to him, if I ever hear that's a fist, I'm going to the police. So he got smart. There were never any fists involved. In fact, he accidentally elbowed me in the temple trying to help me get a spider off the wall when I had shoulder surgery. He accidentally helped me topple down the stairs and end up needing surgery because I was carrying too much and he was worried because I have disability, so he was trying to help me. So it's very hard to put and learning about accidental abuse is really important, because that's a massive part of the coercive control. So we have to keep our eyes on the perpetrator and we have to keep them accountable. I think Hayley's word on accountable, it goes across everything we're talking about. And just remembering that they often aren't, they're playing the game and they can play it for a very long time until they go, I can feel everyone's relaxed now, and then they click straight back into it.
Thank you.
Just going on from what you were saying before about children of domestic violence, I also grew up in a domestic violence household, and the trauma that the next generation carries, which actually perpetrates the whole problem. And many of these men that are doing this to these women are men that have lived in families that were disgraceful. Not that I'm making any excuse for it, but it's the understanding behind what's happening. I didn't realise how much trauma I am carrying until about 6 months ago when my mother died, and it just brought everything up. And if we want to stop this continuation through generations. It's the poor kids that we've really got to try and help.
Yeah, and it's the idea of the modelling, I think, is the
Totally.
problem. Because if you think about it, women do not perpetrate the same way as men, and most of them don't. And I think this is one of the problems. Like, we're culturally saying to men, this is the way a man behaves. And we have to address how we are understanding that culturally. We have to understand how we understand disabilities culturally, because what we are doing is we're getting an ableism focus onto disabilities. So people with disabilities are stuck in that. And you imagine being a child with disabilities in that's even worse. And
My
I
brother
think-
was autistic.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So you had a massive cocktail of what makes it so horrendous for people.
Yeah, it's
and we
terrible.
need to keep rethinking our culture, how we're relating to each other, pull each other up on it. I had a conversation with a man the other night, and I was just appalled at this guy and how he continually was finding women to pull down. And when he finally made a comment about this woman is no good because this abusive man liked her, I drew the line and I said, that's the problem. Because someone is abusive and someone else manages to work with them, the woman gets the label. And we've got to change that. And we've got to stick together, really.
Can I just say one more thing? I think that the generation that's coming through now, like teenage girls and 20-year-olds, etc., are much more aware of this stuff, and they're much more aware of their rights to say to a man, you can't do that, or that's not okay. And there's more and more TV programs that are representing this sort of stuff, which is bringing it into our culture. So I think it's positive.
Thank you.
Can I just make a point before you do move on? I've been trying to say it all this morning, but that's okay. I just wanted to talk about the cultural change and the cultural shift in the Aboriginal community too, as well, because you sort of touched on it earlier around Aboriginal women not wanting their fathers or the partners, going through the justice system, being incarcerated. I think that's changing, and that is changing because, women are worried about their safety. They are worried about their children and the safety of their children. And so sometimes when women, when their partners are incarcerated, it's a time where they actually feel safe and they have a time for respite, to actually feel like they can actually be themselves again and have a good home environment with their kids. So I just wanted to dispel that myth about women. A lot of people just think that Aboriginal women don't want their partners locked up. Women that come to our service as a legal service do want action taken against their partner. They do want safety for themselves and their children, and they do want them locked up if they feel that their safety is jeopardised and they don't feel safe to walk the streets or live in their own homes.
Christine, thank you for raising that. I think it's really important. And Rukhshana, I wanted to know what your response was to that. Within the culturally and linguistically diverse community, is it the case that women, do you think, would welcome the opportunity for their partners to be locked up, spend some time in jail, in terms of this kind of respite that Christine was just talking about?
From the cult community perspective, I think no, they do not want their husbands to be, because if there is at the end of the level that they want to separate or the divorce, there might be an option of this. But otherwise, they want to continue and want to have something like a program for preventions and early intervention in order to reduce the level of the domestic violence in the family. I always thinking about this because that 90% of the women are the victim of the domestic violence, probably 10% of men, the victim of the domestic violence. So I'm always thinking that if there is a possibility of a compulsory training of the domestic violence for men to be, for called men, that they have been raised in an environment where the domestic violence is not recognized. It's a very normal attitude in the family. It is not against law, it is not against tradition, or it is not against anything. So they have to practice this to come in a country that it is recognized as a crime it is a big shock. So training is the key issue and the key factor which helps these men to reduce the domestic violence in the family and provide a safe environment for children and women.
Thank you for that.
I would agree with that too. I
Yes.
think most of the situations that we come across is they don't want it to be the first option. They want it to be the last, but they do want to hold them accountable, and they do actually do want that safety as well.
Just a couple of legal issues I wanted to pick up on with you, Laura. In some cases, the legislated punishment for coercive control is lower than for other forms of assault and related offences. So where does that leave us?
Good question. Well, I think where it leaves us is we have to build on the acknowledgement of the seriousness of the behaviour. So fundamentally, you would think that what that means is assaults are treated more seriously than coercive control behaviours. So there has to be all the things that we're talking about, education of judiciary, etc., to acknowledge that coercive control behaviours are just as dangerous, impactful, etc., as someone punching you. Yeah, I think it just brings us back to exactly what we're all talking about, which is an overall societal system recognition that these behaviours are as impactful, if not more impactful, than an incident or incidents of physical assault.
Can we just thank Hayley, who has to leave? Sorry, we can't let you leave without saying thank you. Goodbye, good luck. Keep up the fight. Thank you, Laura. Just as a follow-up also on that, I wanted to ask you about something else, which is I understand, this is from the reading that I've been doing, to prepare for today, that prohibitive violence orders are not recognised across state borders. And this means, for example, in terms of elder abuse, that there are constantly examples of what's called granny napping, where you take your grandmother and you push her across the state border because on that side of the border, the law applies differently in terms of powers of attorney, etc. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy system. What do we do about that?
Well, I think it was an issue I was talking to Hayley about earlier. It's about having resources and organisations in each state that work together. I mean, I think the problem we have is state-based issues like this. They're dealing with one thing on a state base, another thing on a federal level. So, and that's one of the reforms that's being talked about from the family law system is that AVOs would be brought into the family law system, whereas at the moment it's a state-based AVO, and then the family law system is a federal system. So there's got to be some efforts to unify those issues nationally. I mean, I think I see it even on a smaller level within Sydney, that certain police stations are not communicating via each other. A perpetrator might know that their victim has gone to X police station previously, so they'll get in first and go to another police station. So there just needs to be a more unified system, and I appreciate that that's a huge project, but it needs to happen.
Absolutely. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, we've got a couple.
I just had a question about, we do screening tools to sort of see where survivors and victims are, but when we're talking about perpetrators, because they're very smart, very good at what they do, what's your thoughts on screening tools around perpetrating sort of violence? And the other thing I also wanted to ask around is how important is it with the language that we use when we talk to families? So I work with a lot of families where mum, dad, or mum or dad, however it is, we're working all together, but aware that, we want to keep people safe, but they still might want to stay in the home, and it's really hard for them to sort of flee. So I just want to sort of get your thoughts around those two things.
I'll start with the language part of it. I think one of the really big things we need to have right across the sector is DV trauma-informed training, because I think there's a different focus. When we do trauma-informed training, we tend to do this parent-child model. I'm going to come in, I'm going to help you, where what we've been developing in the DV sector is much more of a alongside trauma-informed training. And I think that needs to happen right across the board. And once we start getting into working with people, like language is so important. And having language that empowers people, having language that looks at strengths. So rather than saying to someone, oh, you shouldn't have run away, go, wow, that was a really incredible thought to run away because that protected you. So let's look at how we could maybe change that now. Do you need to keep running away, or is there a way we can, what other way can you see forward? So it's taking that strengths-based, empowered approach to what people are doing, which reframes then for them what they're doing. Because if we come in to say, this is, I might be misunderstanding your question, but if we're coming in to say to someone, look, that you can't do that and that's not working and that's terrible, immediately you've taken them back into where they've been and they've lost all ability to stand up and be strong and go, yep, I know how to do this. What was the other part of your question? Oh, it was tools, wasn't it? Yeah.
Is it working? Hello? Oh, yeah, it's working. Yeah, and language, I think, also across the different communities that I work with as well, like their understanding of what coercive control means. And I understand, you know, when I talk to some families, I may use the word domestic violence or I may use family violence. So sort of just thinking that sort of aspect as well as how do communities see the language, how they see the words.
It's asking people what language they're comfortable with. Like I know a friend and she always uses domestic abuse. I will always use domestic violence because I've finally claimed that what I went through was violence. But it's what people are comfortable with. So I think it's like, especially asking in the Aboriginal community, you can speak for yourself, what they want. And
yeah, I'll just touch on that because at Wirringa Baiya, how we see it is domestic violence is the intimate relationship and we see the family violence as the extended. Because what we find is if we call it just family violence, that's coercive control because that's controlling that individual to do what the family wants. So if they say stay because, you know, we've got to keep the family together, we've got to keep you in community, that's that additional pressure. So if we see it as a separation, we think that's important. But I just think if you're talking about language and issues like that, I think it's also important that everyone's had the, you know, cultural competency training around particular communities that they're working with. And, you know, so there's the Aboriginal community, but there's other communities as well that there may be a higher number in that actual community you're working in. So actually get that specific expertise around that group, you know, because it just can't be one size fits all because it doesn't. And how we work as an Aboriginal organisation in Sydney is different to how we operate in an organisation out in rural community and the way we, you know, I think it's just different. You just sort of have to understand the lay of the land and work within the parameters of what they want and how they want to be taught or what they want to learn or what they want to talk about because we're not there to tell people what they've got to do. And I think that's around that thing around where you're saying around the home, whether or not they leave the home or where they go. At the end of the day, we also try to empower people through having choice and making their choice be the choice that they make and that we support them in that, but we also talk about what's, you know, safety elements, safety exit plans, you know, what are the other options, just, you know. One of the things I didn't do in my bio was say that I was on the deaf review team. So I've been on the New South Wales deaf review team for a couple of years and we see situations where women have been, you know, have really strong support around them. They have been giving all this information and they still stay and they still end up being a victim of a domestic homicide. We see other women where the systems have failed them and they end up being a victim of domestic homicide. So it's just about trying to give everyone as much information as we can to work with them on you know, on their level in a way that we're respectful of their culture, their community and what their choices are. And we give them as much information as we can and hopefully they'll, you know, remain safe. But we, you know, there's not much we can do around that sometimes.
got another question here, and then we're
Hi.
going to come for a final question to the gentleman in the back row,
Cool.
I think.
Look, I guess my question is from a legal and a cult perspective. So I'm also an Afghan woman and a survivor of DFE and forced marriage as well. So I guess, look, I got really lucky. I was born and raised here. I had a job. I could pay my rent and get out of home. But a lot of my clients that come through now from these cold backgrounds, their families think they're above the law. So the law doesn't operate here like it would back home for them. And I guess my question is, a lot of these men and even these mothers, fathers and mothers, think that they don't have to follow our law, you know, it's just our family, that's our culture, that's our custom. If they're, like Talie said as well, my father, for example, was a great man in the community. He still is. All the neighbours love him. My family loves him. You don't question him. He's the oldest. How can we get into these communities without actually... Because there's no evidence of anything. There's nothing there. You don't hear about anything. You don't see anything. And when it gets too late, we need to go in there. But how can we get in there in the very beginning to educate these men and mothers and fathers and whatever before anything even happens? I mean, you've got to have a good enough reason to be like, well, we need to educate you people. But they're like, well, we don't need to know anything. We're fine. It's our family. There's nothing going on here. It's just a kid being a kid. Like she just, you know, for example, when I went through it, you just take it on Western values and cultures. You're not being an upholding Afghan woman anymore. Well, I was born and raised here. Where you were born and raised, completely different world to where I've come from and where I am. You chose to have us here and raise us here. We cannot be what you expect us to be. So how can we get in there in the very beginning? Because our community and culture, especially for Afghans, domestic violence isn't a thing. It is not a thing. Forced marriage isn't an issue. It's just not a problem until it becomes, you know, when the woman's pretty much on the verge of like being murdered. And even divorce, you did not divorce your partner. You will stay in the relationship till you die, your kids will die with you, but you did not leave your partner for fear of shame and honour killings and culture. It does not happen. And it's just, you know, I try to get in there as an Afghan woman being a social worker as well, and I'm like, they're like, well, no, it's not a problem. Nothing happens here, we're all okay, it's all happy families. But for these women and my aunties and other women who I know and see all the time, they cannot escape. They can't go anywhere. These men control them. Their children are not leaving either because of fear for their mothers as well. So how can we get in there, to sum all that up anyway, how can we get in there, you know, in a way that they will accept some kind of approach from us, from anybody? That's, I guess, what I want to know. I know it's a hard kind of thing to answer, but how can we get in there to help these communities and these people? Yeah, like I'm sure I hope you get what I'm saying. I'm getting really like frustrated about it, as you can see. But it's just, how do you get in there and make them like, you know, get them to understand what you're saying, that it is wrong. You do have, there is a law here that works the way it works to protect us. It is not what it is overseas, but how can we get in there and kind of just say, accountability, yeah, exactly.
Education, Rukhshana.
Yeah.
Just want to add, I agree about this, whatever that you are experiencing and saying, it is right. But it depends on the level of the education, the awareness of the issue of the domestic violence. Because our women, that they are coming on a, for example, age of 30 or 40 or say 50, so they have this idea that domestic violence is a very private issue. It should be kept inside, and even they are not going to tell to other family. And also, some of our ladies that are coming here, they do not have a high education, and they do not have gone to school, and they are illiterate, and they do not have this strength, and they are not strong enough to voice out. And there was no support because of the family shame and the cultural values and the cultural aspects. So when they are coming here, I know that even some old ladies at the very old stage, that in our culture, in our community, it is very shameful to ask for divorce. They have asked for divorce because she is fed up with this. Because the circumstances here is providing this opportunity for women to speak out and to voice their issues, and there are some legal and law that they can assist them in. And even some ladies that they are divorced, for example, legally, but religiously they cannot be divorced because man does not want to have this.
Can I just add one very quick point to that? You're already doing it.
Yeah.
It's changing it from the inside out, and I think that's where things really change. When you've got people inside communities that are speaking up, that are causing a ripple, and it's a slow effect. It's like, you know, the pebble in the pond, and it has that ripple effect. So I want to say, awesome, you're amazing, you're already doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Talie. I was going to say the same thing, that how lucky are we that you decided to become a social worker. Thank you for your commitment, because you are going to make a difference. You are making a difference. We've got one last question over here.
I guess I just wanted to say thank you for starters. This has been an amazing experience. You know, my job is I work with the Education Centre Against Violence, and I work with the Aboriginal portfolio as an Aboriginal man. And I guess one of the things that we're discovering is the incredible amount of education that's still needed within this sector. Certainly, as you said, within the judiciary, but also with some of the other larger government organisations. And you know, what we're doing at the moment is working with the difference between cultural sensitivity and cultural safety, and there's a huge difference. You know, what we're finding is that in many different areas, especially, I can only speak for in the Aboriginal portfolio, is the amount of people who go to report and the lack of safety that's provided for them. How do you see that changing, Chris?
I think the important thing, and everyone says it shouldn't be about money, but it has to be. It has to be about resourcing. It has to be thinking outside the square too, because I think, you know, not every community has hotels and everything else there. So we need to sort of look at mapping that exercise across the state, looking what how it sort of got touched on earlier, how services and organisations are communicating with each other. So there's no gaps. No one can fall through gaps. We know who's doing what roles are taken up, and filling those gaps so that we know the person has comprehensive coverage. And that doesn't just extend to the victim, but to the perpetrator and the children, if there are children involved, because it's bigger than that. And we can't make a difference until we start looking at all of it. You know, the whole with a holistic approach around being able to provide those services to all of those people involved, but also being able to provide the financial resources, the accommodation, the housing, the legal support, and support services, particularly counselling, because that's one of the biggest things, is the trauma that our community has experienced over a number of generations. We need to start looking at that as well, because we've got some people that have been extremely traumatised and had really horrific histories. And so for us to be able to move ahead, we need to start identifying that, working on that, but also being able to provide those resources. And, you know, Aboriginal communities, it seems to be that there's a sort of thought that Aboriginal communities should do it off their own back in a way, because you're community and you should be there for each other and you should be supporting each other. And most of our communities aren't funded very well. So that's one of the important things, is being able to provide services, but being able to provide them in those communities to non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal services, because it's about choice once again. Some Aboriginal people will want to go to an Aboriginal service and some won't. So it's about giving them the option.
Well, we have an almighty fight on our hands. I think that's the takeaway from this morning, is there is so much that we have to do. And we cannot do that on an empty stomach. So we hope that you are going to stay and join us for some sustenance, because nourishment is key to kind of carrying on and having the energy for the fight. In the meantime, I would like you to join me in thanking Talie, Christine, Laura, Rukhshana, and Hayley. Thank you also for being a great audience.
Before ending this session, I just wanted to say that we believe that coercive control is a violent act. We support this, and it could be considered as a crime. But we believe that the circumstances of every individual migrants, refugee, multicultural, and diverse women and children and other individuals should be considered while the legislation is making. And also it needs a wide range of consultation with the community, including the younger adults, male younger adults, and also the community leaders and community religious leaders, women, elder women and men, before, finalizing the legislation. Yeah.
I wanted to take this opportunity to thank, firstly, for giving up your time, panel, today. Big round of applause, please. We've got some gifts for you. Hayley got hers before she ran out the door. And also for Deborah Linnis for giving us that lovely welcome today. And we're wrapping up now. We're going to have lunch, but big round of applause for the panel. Also for the West Council, tech guys, Yummy and myself who've been coordinating and collaborating. We wanted to say thank you for giving up your morning, and for those tuning in at home, thank you very much. If we haven't got to your questions online, we'll try and get back to them. But please share the recording when it comes out, because I think this discussion today was really important. And I want to take an opportunity to say thank you once again, panel.